بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله ثم أما بعد. In this session of Fiqh of Da'wah, we continue our reflection in Imam Zarnuji's text, Instruction of the Student, Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, and we are going to change the direction of the reflection. We initially said that what we want to do is re-image the person that's doing da'wah as a student of knowledge. We want to orient the da'wah, the call to Islam, the education of the people in Islam, in such a way that the person that is engaging in da'wah activities or teaching and so on and so forth is considering himself or herself as a student of knowledge. Because too often what we see is that people get involved in educating others in Islam and being active in the community. And we call all of these things da'wah. Da'wah has many conceptualizations and many definitions, and we don't want to get into that. But what we want to say is that all of these things constitute da'wah for the sake of simplicity. But what we find is that people become active in the community, they become active in blogging, they become active in writing, they become active in teaching. And then we find even some people become active in giving khutbahs. And they don't orient themselves as students of knowledge. So what happens is that they don't grow in the proper way. Da'wah cannot be executed properly without us taking on the characteristics of students of knowledge. The characteristics of the student of knowledge is what we are going to focus on, because we want to talk about the necessity of reviving our understanding of da'wah. And in doing so, we want to keep in line with the writings of the ulama and the book and the sunnah. So here we selected the text, Instruction of the Student. It's a favorite text of mine, as a way to reflect, but not reflect without a basis, to reflect within the context of Islamic culture and civilization itself, and then see how we can orient ourselves in the contemporary world by thinking through our situation with our own tradition. So we're going to use a contemporary educational approach. We're not going to read the whole of the text. But what I've done is pinpointed a few key lines across 3 pages, pages 28, 29, and 30, of Instruction of the Student. This is the old print in English. And what I have done is brought an educational background and pinpointed some skills, 5 skills across these 3 pages, which I hold essential for us as students of knowledge. And it's not that I came to this conclusion independently, but in reading an educational philosophy, and in particular in this text, which is educational philosophy from an Islamic perspective, these skills have become so fundamental for the student across the board that it's impossible for us to even claim to be students of knowledge without orienting ourselves in such a way that we are able to master these skills. And we find these skills are researched and debated as to their importance and how to achieve them and how to cultivate them within schools of education across the world. And I borrowed my orientation to this last skill not only from what I found in the text of Imam Zarnuji, but what I found in the writings of the ulama in regard to the history of fiqh. Consultation, shura, we know, is a mandate of the Quran. It's a command of the Quran. And we see that Umar bin al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu al-Faruq, he was one of the companions, which we see clearly in his time period as Khalifa, a person who oriented the Muslim community to practice consultation. So Umar, he would gather the companions who were the most knowledgeable and consult them on matters. And when those matters pertain to issues of fiqh or legislation or the halal and the haram, their decision as a group became what we call ijma' or consensus. So consultation is a way to achieve consensus. And we know, those of us who are familiar with usul al-fiqh, with the principles of fiqh, with the principles that we use to read the Quran and the Sunnah and extract opinions from the Quran and the Sunnah, or positions regarding what's halal or haram, or what do we believe or don't believe, we know that consensus is something that is not easy to achieve when we're talking about consensus in the Shari'i sense or in the understanding of the Sharia. Now, we as a community, a small part of our community may come together and they may be able to achieve a consensus among themselves. But to do this at the level of the Ummah is quite difficult. But inshallah, it is possible that consensus can be achieved. But we have to develop a culture which facilitates shura, and that shura becomes a way of moving the leadership in the community, the future leadership in the community, towards consensus building. But in any event, we got beyond ourselves. These 5 skills were extracted from my reading of Imam Zarnuji, and I entitled that reading The Way of the Student, Readings and Imam Zarnuji. So these 5 skills can be categorized into 3 types: a practical aptitude, an intellectual aptitude, and an interpersonal aptitude. Now, there's a reason why I listed interpersonal aptitudes in the plural, but I don't want to get into that at the moment. But there's 3 categories or types, and these 5 skills fall into these 3 categories or types. The first we list as a practical aptitude. The second and the third we list as an intellectual aptitude. And the fourth and the fifth we list as interpersonal aptitudes. Now, altogether, these skills, these categories, these aptitudes constitute an attitude or an orientation. Again, altogether, these skills, these 5 skills, and these 3 aptitudes, right, they constitute an attitude or an orientation which is essential for the student of knowledge to develop and have, right? For the student of knowledge to develop and have. We talked a little bit about listening and writing. But what we want to do, because we changed the orientation, prior, I was of the opinion that I should take each of these skills as are found in Imam Zarnuji's text, rahmatullahi alayhi, and then research them in the Quran and the Sunnah and in the writings of the ulama, and give a basis for the validity of each of these skills from the source text. After some thought during Ramadan, what I felt was that may be too much upon myself and upon the student of knowledge time-wise. So I decided to take the approach of the scholars of fiqh in their presentation of information. And we have exemplars like Ibn Qudama, rahimahullah. Imam Ibn Qudama, along with many others, but Ibn Qudama is worth mentioning, rahmatullahi alayhi. He developed a curriculum to study fiqh in which he had 4 levels. The first level is the level of orientation and foundation building. So what he saw was that at that first level, the student should be oriented to fiqh in such a way that there's no confusion, that the student has a clear understanding through a simplified presentation of what is the issue that's being studied. And then overall, after studying so many issues, you develop an orientation which allows you to have comprehended a certain amount of knowledge which is essential to go on to the other three levels. And then what we find is more complexity. As each level, you deal with various opinions, you deal with whys, you deal with the proofs, and so on and so forth. And then you deal with ultimately conflict, varying opinions, right, at a higher level. So we decided to take the insight of Ibn Qudama and apply it to, not to fiqh, but to how to present educational philosophy. The scholars in the past, we find that they were very oriented into the whole concept of how to present knowledge to the community. So we find many writings that the ulama have put forward and have produced as a way to teach us how to be students of knowledge. Right? An essential element of being a student of knowledge is character building. Right? Here we're talking about aptitudes, right? But we're really not getting into the issue of character building with much depth until we get to the higher level. Right? Of course, we have issues that pertain to character at the lower levels, or the foundational levels, I should say. But those skills, as far as virtues are concerned, those skills, as far as they relate to virtue, are not very manifest until you get to the higher level. So the student of knowledge must always reflect upon, how am I comporting myself? How am I presenting myself? Not from an ego perspective, but from the perspective of measuring whether we conform in our behavior, in our speech, in our attitude, in our presentation to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is the importance of studying Seerah, the importance of studying the biography of the Prophet Muhammad, and the Shama'il, the characteristics of the Prophet Muhammad, physically and morally or ethically, or so that we take on that persona. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the model par excellence. He's the supreme model for us as far as humanity, or embodying humanity, is concerned. So, for the sake of time, what we find is that the ulama, they have said that listening and reading is something that's very important. Right? And we find Imam Zarnuji, he says on page 28, but the student should not write anything unless it is fully understood. For writing down of undigested matter blunts the character, ravages intelligence, and wastes time. It is important that the student exert himself strenuously to understand what he is offered by the teacher, applying intelligence, reflection, and much repetition. Right? The application regarding much repetition and so on and so forth, the application of the skill of repetition, we don't talk about it here, but Imam Zarnuji is mentioning, is to constantly review what you heard from the teacher. So there's an assumption there that you digested what was presented to you. This is where listening takes priority over writing. Listening is about comprehension. Writing is about preservation. Although we know in contemporary educational philosophy that writing is a way for the student to engage a sense. So when the student, we have multiple senses by which we engage knowledge. Some people are visual learners, some people are audio learners, and some people are experiential learners. They need to be involved. So what we find is that writing, as it was understood by the ulama of the past, what we find is that writing is a tool of preservation. What they came to conclude was that attention is diverted and divided when the mind's eye is not focused along with listening to what is being said. Because when the person is writing, your mind, your attention is focused on what you're writing. And you're trying to remember what was being said. So if we take some contemporary models of education, we come to understand one is that the attention is divided. Two, the brain is being worked in such a way that it's not that easy to retrieve from memory. It's not that easy to retrieve from long-term memory, right? Or from short-term memory, sorry. What was said, so that you can take what's in your short-term memory from what was said in the near past and write it down. Too many processes at work. So the ulama, they simplified. And we find even that the ulama of Mauritania, hafidhumullah, even when they educate the students, they like to focus on just one subject matter at a time, rather than crowding the attention of the student by studying 5, 6, 7 different subjects. The student studies one subject at a time. This develops the ability of the student to focus. And we find that those scholars put a lot of emphasis on memory. Right? We find that those scholars put a lot of emphasis on memory. And there may be a wisdom in that. There may be a wisdom in focusing on one subject, because that's a culture which focuses also on developing a strong memory. Here in the West, we focus on analytical skills. Right? So the ability to analyze is more important than memorization. The two go together. Analyzation is a higher level. It's a higher level intellectual process. It's one of the highest levels in the ability to generate new understandings. This is what we call in our tradition ijtihad, right? When we go to Bloom's taxonomy in educational philosophy, we find that he talks about these type of things. Cognitive skills. Not all cognitive skills are the same. Not all cognitive aptitudes are at the same level. So I hope that this point is clear. Writing, when you write, and if you don't comprehend what was understood, then you may misunderstand. And also what it begins to do is it begins to destroy your ability to focus. Right? And you become used to this, having always to be engaged in writing. And what happens to your mind's eye is that it begins to lose direction. And what happens is that your short-term memory is not able to maintain information, because attention is divided between focusing on what was said, and focusing on what's being said, and focusing on writing. This is what happens when students try to write while the teacher is talking. It's a big mistake. The approach of the ulama was to write when the mind is clear and after understanding. This is why there is a time for writing, there's a time for listening, but we have to develop our listening skills. So this is a practical aptitude, and this is the foundation. When you have the ability to listen, it means that you're being patient, right? You're comprehending, digesting. Listening means that you're not sitting there waiting to rebut, or to comment on what's being said. You're trying to understand first. The whole issue of discussion comes later on, right? First you comprehend, and then you build on what was being said, or you critique. But comprehension precedes critique, right? Unless there's a question that's to be formulated for clarification of what's said. But first understand, and then proceed to comment, or proceed to what? Critique, so on and so forth. But critique has to be restricted, because critique demands refined character. Critique demands also that you understood properly, because you may put forward a critique and it may be based on a faulty understanding. So listening is a foundational skill. Comprehension is not achieved except by way of listening. And mind you, when we're reading as well, this is a form of listening. You're listening to the text as it's being processed within your mind. Right? You're listening. So at this point, the difference between textual listening and oral listening is that the text before you, right, provides you with a visual representation of information. Whereas a lecture or a course, these things don't provide you with a visual presentation unless there's a PowerPoint presentation, unless you have a handout, so on and so forth. But now we're getting into more contemporary ways of approaching knowledge, because a PowerPoint presentation will usually simplify knowledge for you. Right? So usually the way of the ulama in the past, right, is what? Is for us to listen to them by way of the book. So there's always a visual there, right? For the most part. We don't want to say always in the absolute sense, but this is one of the characteristics of traditional learning, that we read together, that the student and the teacher, we read together. The student reads to the teacher, right? So this is the orientation, that there is a visual there. So you're focusing on the visual and also listening. So you have two modes of orientation, two modes, two points of entry by which the information is coming to you, the knowledge is coming to you. One is the text itself, and then listening to what's being read, because there's usually an orator in traditional circles of knowledge, somebody that reads to the sheikh, or the sheikh reads to the student or students. So listening then takes priority, right? So writing comes with time, and the student should ask permission to write. And this way, the teacher or the sheikh can orient himself in such a way that he allows the student, or she allows the student, to what? To gather the thoughts that are essential to be written. And also this is an opportunity for the teacher to test the student to see if writing takes place. The teacher can ask the student in this time of writing what it is that's going to be written, and how it is that the student understood what is going to be written. And in this sense, you're always having assessment taking place, and you don't need to have formalized assessments, because you have live assessments. You see how the student thinks. It's very interactive and not burdensome, although we're not saying that other forms of assessment or testing are not valid. We're trying to mix methodologies so that people who are oriented to the contemporary system, they can begin to understand how to draw parallels between what they know, what they've experienced in school, and study in the traditional sense. So reading then is a higher level now. Reading implies that we have an understanding of key terms. We have an understanding of background knowledge, right? So for instance, I mentioned Imam Zarnuji in this case, in this session, and I mentioned Abu Hanifa. So there's some, and I mentioned, Abu Hanifa in a context of education, but Imam Abu Hanifa is known for fiqh. So this means that we have to have an understanding who this person is if we're really going to get the benefit of what's being said, right? We're really going to get the benefit of what's being said, because I keyed into Imam Abu Hanifa from the perspective of what? From the perspective of his approach to fiqh and his approach to teaching, right? More so, the teaching element is what I'm concerned with, not his approach to fiqh in itself, but the fact that he used consultation with his students as a way to educate. So reading requires that we have an understanding of key terms, right? That we have an understanding of how the book is structured, and also we have an understanding of subtlety, right? So reading demands that we pay attention. Reading demands that we understand the books that are mentioned, right? Who wrote them? When were they written? Reading understands that we understand the people who are being talked about, right? Reading means that we have to have a certain knowledge. Like for instance, if there's a hadith or ayah of the Quran, is this hadith or ayah of the Quran written the way that we find it in the original? Or and then how do we make sense of the ayah of the Quran, the hadith? Is the context proper? So reading is an in-depth skill. Is the foundational skill. Foundational skill to understand. It's the means to understand, the bridge to understand. So it takes time to learn how to read. The ulama teaches how to read. Right? They teach us how to read a hadith, whether this hadith is to be taken literal or whether it's explained by another hadith. And how do we deal with a word in hadith or an ayah of the Quran that has multiple meanings? Right? Do we just go to the dictionary? Right? Do we go to the dictionary? Or is there another way to be able to come to understand the way that the word is used? These things we learn by way of the teacher. This is why reading on one's own becomes difficult. Although reading can be achieved by oneself, but the level of reading that one can achieve on one's own won't be to the extent that one can achieve with a teacher who is well grounded in this skill. And there's a lot to be said about reading. Right? There's a lot to be said about reading. And this is where the issue of repetition comes. He says, for if reading is limited but repetition and reflection are extensive, then the student will attain a firm grasp and understanding of the material. Imam Zarnuji is focusing on comprehension. Right? Memorization is important, reading is important, but it's not quantity, it's quality that he's concerned with. It's not the quantity of reading, but it's the quality of your reading. Right? Right. Then he says, it is necessary, on page 29, he says at the top, it is necessary to pursue knowledge by means of discussion, right? Debate and inquiry, right? It is also essential that one do these things with fairness, circumspection, and deliberation. One must fortify himself against altercation and anger. This is where the virtue element comes in. What is our attitude? How should we approach others? How should we approach ideas? How should we approach those who differ from us? It is true that discussion and argument are a kind of consultation, and consultation aims at establishing the truth. And it is here that we begin to learn the importance of question formation. Right? We begin to learn the importance of question formation because if we're going to discuss, right, we have to first comprehend what is being said, and then we have to think about what we're going to say, right, before making a comment, a critique, an addition, refuting, agreeing. So question formation is essential, right? And this is the essence of fiqh. The person that's seeking a fatwa, the student of knowledge that's doing research, in order for you to be able to proceed, you have to focus on learning how to develop questions, right? And this will allow you to be able to present information when you think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. Not only questioning, but also making comments, right? So question formation is going to help us to be able to develop how a proper discussion takes place. Discussion can lead to debate or can lead to dialogue. Debate is more confrontational. It has somebody right, somebody wrong, proving points, refuting points. A dialogue is more open, right? A dialogue is more open. Discussion is a little less laid back, like, you may have a discussion exchange, but it's not so intense. Right? But It increases in seriousness and intention when we start to move toward debate and dialogue. Right? Dialogue having its place, debate having its place. Right? These are modes of conversating. Right? Modes of conversating. Discussion is a higher level of conversation, more involved with it. It could be laid back, but it's more involved than just, hey, how are you doing? You start to communicate at a higher level. So debate and dialogue require of us manners. This is what we're learning from Imam Zarnuji. Especially anger is a problem because anger clouds the intellect. And the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam told us, "La taghdab, don't get angry." And he repeated this sallallahu alaihi wasallam more than once. And remember that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he was commanded by Jibreel alayhi salam to read, right? Yaqra. He said, "Ma ana biqari." I'm not a person that's literate, right? He negated himself. He put himself in a position of learning. He didn't establish himself. He negated himself, and Allah taught him. And we see that this is one of the lessons that we learn from the story of Musa and Khidr, alayhi salam. That Khidr tells Musa, if Musa was able to be patient, he would be able to learn more and more. Right? So these are certain things that we learn that are essential as students of knowledge. So we have to learn to develop our listening and writing abilities and know when to write. We have to write neatly as well, right? And write in an organized way. We have to learn how to take notes. And there's a lot of contemporary techniques using highlighters, which will allow us, you can highlight a term, you can highlight a common phrase, a name, you can highlight something you want to remember, you can highlight something you want to come back and research, and using different colors. You develop a system. There's a lot of research on this that can be found. Listening is always the key. It demands of us to be focused. Reading, again, is the key. But reading needs a teacher, right? We can learn. We can learn through listening. It's better to listen to lectures than to read if you don't have a teacher. But this even needs for a person to understand what types of lectures are essential to listen to and what types of lectures are not essential to listen. In any regard, we can't totally dispense with the teacher. And I know that we live in a time which is very difficult to find a teacher. This is the optimal situation. But if you can't, then you have to be aware that there's some techniques that you have to develop. And question formation is also essential. It's essential to the student of knowledge to sit down and think about how to formulate a question. What do I want to say? What do I do not want to say? Right? Some things are better left unsaid. And then we move, after we develop the skill of listening and reading, right, in question formation to a high level, we want to discuss now what we have read, what we have heard. And we have to learn the mannerisms of debate. We have to learn the different positions that a person will take throughout a debate and learn the way they attack and the way they defend and so on and so forth. That's a skill, right? We have, in this society, we have debate teams. It's an art. It has reached the level of art. And dialogue, again, it takes a lot of work. And dialogue has a lot to be said. There's a lot to be said about it, but we want to not go too deep into that. We want to finish off by talking about consultation. Consultation, we find that the ulama have a strict definition. The ulama of usul al-fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence or the philosophy of Islamic law, they have a definition for consensus. And that definition pertains to what? The consensus that is acceptable in the Sharia. But you can have a consensus among scholars of the English language. Or you can have a consensus among hadith scholars. You can have a consensus among scientists. This is what we call in usul al-fiqh an intellectual consensus, right? An intellectual consensus. But this is not a Shari'i consensus, a consensus that is grounded on a matter of legislation in the Sharia. The goal of being able to develop the skill of listening and question formation and comprehending through reading. And you can read. Reading is not only that you read a book, it's also that you're reading a person or reading what's being said. Reading, it's a very in-depth skill, and it has many facets. So learning about reading, learning how to memorize and record positions and so on and so forth in your mind or in your notebook or what have you, we develop the ability to understand. We develop the ability to formulate proper questions, say what needs to be said at the right time. And then we use these skills to develop our ability to discuss things. We know when it's proper to have a regular discussion versus a debate or dialogue. All of these things, all of these skills and aptitudes are to lead us to the level of consultation. When we're able to consult one another, what do you think about this, and so on and so forth. When we're able to appreciate the position of the other, we're able to come closer to the position of unity, right? We're able to come closer to the position of unity because we have the intellectual, the practical, and the interpersonal skills that are necessary for unity. And then we start to move toward consensus building where we come to agree on things, right? We can agree on things. We can have a consensus on matters that are not related to the Sharia, but we don't call this consensus in the sense of ijma' as understood in usul al-fiqh as regards position of the Sharia, but we call it a consensus on the matter. If we have a full agreement, then we call it consensus. If we have a partial agreement, we call that a strong agreement or an agreement. But these are the goals here. These are the skills. These are the aims, the targets that we want to develop in ourselves. We want to be able to discuss with one another. We want to be able to consult one another. We want to be able to have the intellectual abilities to make us strong students of knowledge. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله والحمد لله والحمد لله رب العالمين.